just before we got on, I feel like the film just becomes more and more relevant. So Rachel, welcome.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
I want to just ask if you have questions for Rachel. We will ask questions at the end. And so please put them into the chat and I will share them with Rachel. So Rachel, you made the film 8 years ago, right? It came out in 2014. So a very different time than today on a lot of levels. So what inspired you and Rachel Pasternak to make the film? Were you introduced because you wanted to make the film, or were you introduced because somebody thought maybe you'd make a good pair?
Oh, no, Rachel and I, when we started this project, we had already known each other for a while, for a number of years. We met when we were both young, working people in New York City. And we were actually introduced by a friend of mine, the same person who introduced me to my husband, actually introduced me to Rachel. He didn't really introduce me to my husband, but he knew my husband, and he knew me before we knew each other. And he was one of the things that brought us together. This friend met Rachel at a party, and then he said to me the next day, you know, I met this woman, her name is Rachel, and she's interested in all the same things you are. You should really meet her. So we met and we had lunch and we started talking, and that was it. We became fast friends, and it was really a meeting of the minds. We both at the time were very involved in family history, doing family histories. I was the director of the Genealogy Institute. We were both involved in doing oral histories, so interviewing people and getting their stories, specifically older Jewish folks, and capturing their memories. And we were both really fascinated with this question of storytelling and how identity is transmitted from one generation to the next through storytelling. And the idea that, you know, a sort of religious idea that scripture in a way never ends, right? That people are always transmitting these stories of the previous generations, and those stories become how we understand ourselves. So we also both, I think it's a little bit relevant to the film, we both had very close relationships with our grandfathers, and we each had been sort of the recipient of our grandfather's stories. When I was a freshman in college, my grandfather wrote his life story to me in a series of letters. And Rachel had a similar experience where she was the one who asked the questions. She was the one who would sit and listen to the stories. And we were both that person. So we came together and we started working on projects together. And eventually that led to our making the film.
So what inspired you to make this film? I mean, I have to admit, before I read about the film, I didn't know very much about Joachim Prinz. Maybe I should be embarrassed to admit that, but I didn't. And when I talked to colleagues and friends about it, they also had not heard about him.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really hadn't either. And, you know, I have a PhD in religious studies. I studied contemporary Jewish thought, modern Jewish thought. Rachel knew about Rabbi Prinz because her grandparents were members of his temple. And so she, in her master's program, she did some original research on Rabbi Prinz, and there was very little out there that had been published. She was one of the first people to actually go into his archives and start doing the history and piecing it together, and asking the family questions. This was also encouraged by Rabbi Colwyn, who's in the film, who became the rabbi of B'nai Abraham, and he knew about Prince's story. And he became very active in preserving the history and one of the champions of the film project. So really, the reason we made the film was exactly what you expressed, that we couldn't, once Rachel told me about him, and she showed me his speech at the March on Washington, and I read the transcript, and these words were spoken before I was born. But I felt like I had been waiting my whole life to hear somebody say what he said. And it was almost like, why has this been hidden from me, from us? Why has the story been hidden? And we felt a really strong sense of obligation to kind of unearth this story and share it. So that's what we decided to do.
We're grateful that you did.
Well, we're grateful for people like you and your institution that share it with the world.
Like you said, stories are the way that we transmit values, and it's our obligation. I mean, I feel like as so the community is how I see it. So, I mean, Rabbi Prinz was fearless, and I thought about his early life, and I wonder, because you made the point that he respected his father, but his father was like the authority in the house, and that he was very close to his mother. And it just made me wonder, like, where did that fearlessness come from? Have you thought about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think some of it did come from losing his mother at a young age. I think that part of his attitude was that, in a sense, the worst thing that maybe could have happened to him already happened. Yeah. And I think that gives you a kind of fearlessness. Like, I survived
losing my mother.
So what, someone's not going to like me? Like, oh, that's really going to hurt my feelings. Someone's going to disagree with me. Even someone's going to threaten me or put me in jail. It's just not that big of a deal in comparison. So I think there was that. And then I do think that his relationship to God and to Judaism and to Jewish identity and the Jewish people was an incredible source of strength. And you can see this in activists and prophets of all stripes, right? I mean, this is where, Martin Luther King said, "I've been to the mountaintop."
Right.
The night before he was murdered. And it was the idea that, I am part of something that's bigger than myself. And I'm basically a vessel for this message. And so in a way, what happens to me doesn't really matter, because the story goes on, the work goes on, and I've spoken my prophecy and I've done my part. So I think all of those things were, part of what made him strong and fearless.
Well, and then, even working within the civil rights movement, when you think about what he had faced in Nazi Germany, I think, to me, and I wonder how our audience sees it, but to me, when he talks about silence being the worst thing, so powerful. He was just amazing. And I know that you can't speak for him, but you've done a lot of thinking about him. You've done a lot of learning about him and studying about him and research, and knowing all that you know about him. What do you think he would think about the current situation in the United States, the relationship of Jews and Blacks in the United States? Frankly, the whole the whole society, what's going on in general. I mean, you can't help but string together those images of violence in Nazi Germany, violence during the civil rights movement, and violence at the siege of the Capitol. And so I wonder if somebody who's so familiar with him and has done so much thinking about him, would he be disappointed?
You mean disappointed because we haven't made more progress?
Disappointed because we haven't learned. We have, and we were making progress. I feel like we were making progress at one time. We were working together, and he talks about the importance of working together, not just hoping, not just praying that, things would get better, but that we would work together to make a difference. And at some point we stopped working together.
Yeah, I think this actually ties together. My response to this ties together with the question you asked me at the very beginning about why we made this film. And I think somewhat implicit in that question is, why don't we all know about Rabbi Prinz, right? Because we made the film to remedy what we saw as essentially an error in the narration of American history and American Jewish history, right? And the error was that Prinz was not in that story.
Right.
Then the question is why? And of course, that's a complicated question. And there are a lot of people whose stories need to be told who aren't in the story, particularly women. So that's part of it, just that in our historiography of the civil rights movement, we still, and even of the Nazi period and the Holocaust, right? We still sort of have only been looking at a few different big figures like Martin Luther King or, Leo Beck or something like that. And there are so many more people to pay attention to. So part of it is that, just that we need time to pay more attention to more of these people in history who were important. As I said, particularly women. But some of it is that we glance at this at the end of the film, but we could have done more about it, which is that, Jonathan Prinz says at the end of the film that Rabbi Prinz's stance on peace in Israel and a two-state solution didn't win him a lot of friends.
Yes.
The truth is that towards the end of his career, what he was saying was not particularly popular. And he was not only being very outspoken, not only about peace in Israel, but also about how the American Jewish community was afraid to, was taking a very sort of Israel right or wrong position, and was afraid to have a really robust debate within itself.
Right.
He also was very critical of some of the stances that the American Jewish Congress, after he retired from it, some of the stances that they took. For example, the American Jewish Congress and several other important Jewish organizations were against affirmative action, and he was for affirmative action. His view, so it was pretty convenient. After he actually, the last 10 years of his life, he had dementia, and so he wasn't in the public eye. So it was pretty convenient to neglect telling his story and to sort of forget about him, because he was sort of against the mainstream of American Jewish thought during that sort of post-civil rights era. And he lost a lot of his following as a result. So So now I'm trying to remember what your question was. Your original question was, oh, what would he say about today, and what sort of what happened, and would he be disappointed? I think, if I can be a little bit perhaps brutally honest, I think Rabbi Prinz's stance was that it kind of boiled down to the biblical quote that we have in the film, that you shall not oppress the stranger because you have been strangers. I think his stance was that whether or not you are in a position of power, whether or not you're in a privileged or advantaged position, you take the side of the disadvantaged. It's a very simple rule to live by, but it's not that easy. I've been trying it lately. Trust me, it's not that easy, and you're not always popular when you do it. And sometimes the disadvantaged and the people that you're taking the side of, human beings aren't perfect, right? So those folks are going to make mistakes too, and screw up and not be perfect, and sometimes say things that you don't want to hear. But when he came to America and he became not a Jew in Germany, but a white person in America, his stance was, I'm never going to forget that I was a Jew in Germany.
Right.
And that we were slaves. So that means that my side is always with the enslaved. It's always with the oppressed, no matter how difficult that makes things. And so I think if he had any disappointment, I think he would like more of us to be more outspoken on the side of the oppressed, whether or not we're in that position at that moment ourselves.
Right. I mean, look, there was a change occurred at some point, like during the civil rights movement, where the Jewish community aligned themselves with the Black community and marched with them, and took a more vocal and active role in it. And in the struggles of the Black community in America.
Mhm.
And at a certain point, from the Black community, it was kind of like, okay, thank you, but like, we're going to move on. Like, now we're gonna
Yeah, well, that's
right?
the story that we tell. That's the story that we tell. I think it's a little more complicated than that.
Right. That's
I
what I
think-
was going to ask you. Like,
Yeah.
I think, there's
It's
my
sort of
story,
like,
your story, and
I
the
always-
truth, right? But
Exactly. I always think of, and this is not to judge people, I always think of, my grandmother grew up in Newark, and I live right near Newark now. And Newark, of course, was the home of a thriving American Jewish community, Philip Roth, et cetera, and Rabbi Prinz. And so I always think of that white Jewish family sitting at their kitchen table and saying, oh, hey, they're offering these really good mortgages, and they're federally insured. We could move to Maplewood, where I live now, or we could move to South Orange, or we could move to Livingston and have a nice house and a yard, et cetera. Let's take that mortgage. Let's go. They didn't understand at the time that they were participating in white flight, and that only white people, including Jews, were offered those good mortgages and were encouraged to move out to the suburbs. So, I'm always really cautious that the film not be used to sort of pat ourselves on the back, because during the process of the civil rights movement and the whole post-World War II period, right? Prior to World War II, there was so much anti-Semitism in America.
Right.
But by the time World War II was over, now America had in its head we're the saviors of the Jews. All right. We don't have to talk about how many people they turned away and didn't let in, and how anti-Semitic this country was. People don't like to talk about that, but it's true. But after the Second World War, it was like, well, this is the land of freedom, right? And even the civil rights bills, remember, they guaranteed equality, not just on the basis of race, but on the basis of sex and religion and national origin. So white women, immigrants, and white ethnics like Jews and Italians were major beneficiaries of the civil rights bills. And through a lot of racist policies, Black people did not benefit as much from the civil rights bills as we might have hoped. So from the Jewish point of view, or the white Jewish point of view, it's sort of like, well, we marched with you, we did all this stuff, we stood up for you, we took risks, etc. Now it's time for you to thank us, and we're going to go on our merry way and be white and take advantage of everything, and we're going to be against affirmative action because it hurts us, we perceive it as hurting us, etc. So that's, there's sort of two sides to every story, right? And so I think it's complicated. And I think where we're coming to now, because there is a resurgence of anti-Semitism in this country.
Yes.
And there obviously is continued systemic racism. I think our communities are, again, coming to a place of, first of all, there are Black Jews. So our communities are, we acknowledge, intertwined and overlapping.
Absolutely. It's about
and-
time time that we came to that.
Exactly. But also, I think there is a little bit of a return to the recognition that you don't have to agree on everything, but that you have to stand together. We really don't have a choice if we want to survive and thrive.
Isn't that what Dr. Prinz said, that Rabbi Prinz said, like, you have to love one another. You don't have to like everything about each other, but you have to love each other as human beings. Like,
exactly.
I think we have this shared trauma, that, because I believe that racism is defined by how other people see us, and so finding those points of commonality and the fact that we're human beings, and coming to love one another, I think can only work in the best interests of not only our communities, our own communities, but in the best interests of mankind, of humankind.
Mm-hmm.
So, but he was certainly somebody who was, he was a leader kind of before his time. Like he had that knack of kind of bringing things to light before maybe they were popular, before maybe they were what people wanted to hear. If you think about it, Nazi Germany in the early 30s, people thought Hitler, he'll go away, this is not so serious. His thinking.
I was just going to say, we really need to be vigilant because, historians will remind us that Hitler, ran and lost before he ran and won. And so, just because we have Biden in office now doesn't mean that we're home free. We really have to be vigilant, especially with all of these. I mean, these voting rights bills, I think, are a good example of where it's so important that everyone recognize how the country is harmed when, when minority votes are threatened.
Yeah, that's a scary proposition, to be
Yes.
sure, to be sure. We know that the synagogue in Newark is now a church. Can you tell us, like, is there a relationship between the congregations? In Chicago, same story, the story that you told, they went from the west side to Skokie or whatever, and we're always taking tours of the church, the synagogues, in the old neighborhoods. But there's not that much commonality or camaraderie. So I wondered, because he was such a strong leader, is there any relationship between the two communities?
I haven't kept up with it, so I can't speak to the last like 2 to 3 years. But while Rabbi Cohen was at B'nai Abraham, yes, there was a very nice, and I expect that his Rabbi Cohen retired, so I expect that the new rabbi is probably maintaining this. But yes, there was a relationship for sure, and Rabbi Cohen was very active in trying to have the Jewish community in the suburbs in general sort of be supportive of the city of Newark and be part of the resurgence of the city, be a healthy, good part, not by going in and trying to gentrify and take charge of everything, but just by being supportive of the people there. So there was, yes, a nice relationship last time I checked.
I hope it continues. We can hope, right? Maybe they'll work together and make it happen, and then we won't have to hope. It'll just be a fact. Before we got on, you and I were talking about youth.
Mhm.
And I was saying to you that I was disappointed in reading my children's history books. I'll be honest. I was disappointed with the way that the whole civil rights movement was presented to them. I felt like it was somewhat glossed over. I felt like there was more emphasis on, like I said, the Magna Carta and like European history, and then in our own American history, and especially more recent history. And so I wondered, how is your film kind of being shared with youth today? I don't think it could be any more relevant than today. I realize that the pandemic kind of put a cramp in our ability to, like reach out to teenagers through schools in the same way. I mean, this whole year has been somewhat of a challenge, but as we move forward, how would you like your film to inspire future generations? I know that you're into genealogy. I know that that's important to you, like generations before and generations to come.
The film has been shown in many schools. Obviously, probably like any historical filmmaker, I would love for the film to be part of curriculum. I think that I sometimes hesitate to focus too much on education, because I think that sometimes when young people have such a good nose for hypocrisy.
Mhm.
And I don't think that just sticking a film like ours in front of them does the job, because I think that if their larger curriculum is still the same, and if they're sitting in a segregated school,
Mhm.
or they're sitting in a school that is 2 schools in 1 school, where Black students are in the lower level classes and white students are in the higher level classes, they just think we're kind of BSing them. Oh, look at all this. Look how we came together in the past, and look how great we are, and look how far we've come. And I try to focus more on adults trying to change things and teach by example. And I think Rabbi Prinz is a great example. But I remember when I was a teenager or a young person, and I remember being shown things like that. And I remember thinking about the adults showing me these films and thinking, well, you're telling me that I should go out on the streets and do this. What are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
So I try as an adult to, emulate Rabbi Prinz. Obviously, I'm not like him, but in terms of my actions, and I'm very involved here locally in trying to make our school system more equitable and standing with, my Black neighbors to fight for the things that their kids need. And so just as much as I want young people to see this film, I want them to see us doing this work. Yeah, exactly. Because if we show them the film and we're not walking the walk, they just think it's a bunch of BS.
Right. No, I agree with you. It's on us. It's on us, the adults, to set the example. He set the example for us, and we have to set the example
Right.
for them.
Mm-hmm.
But while you're not Rabbi Prinz, in bringing the story to us, you're walking the walk.
Thank you for saying
You're
that.
definitely walking the walk. Let me ask you, what is your next project? Because I know you're not done. So what are you doing next?
Well, I've been working on writing screenplays, which I got into for a variety of reasons. But one of them is that it took us 7 years to make this documentary, and we had to do a lot of fundraising, and there were a lot of roadblocks put up in front of us. And so one thing that I love about writing is that nobody can stop you from doing it. And it works out great in a pandemic too. So I've been working on a script about Frances Perkins, who was the first female cabinet secretary in US history. She was labor secretary under FDR. And among other things, she was pretty much the only person in Roosevelt's cabinet who tried to help Jewish refugees come to America, get visas and come to America. So I've been working on a script about her. And then I do have an idea for perhaps my next documentary, which will be about segregated education in Philadelphia, which is my hometown. But we'll see. That's in
Down
the
the road.
Yeah, exactly.
What is it about making documentaries that you like?
I really like, and even in the screenwriting, I've tried to write scripts where it's just purely made up from my head, which is fun, but I really like the constraints of history and facts. You can still use your imagination and you can be creative in how you tell the story, but I like not being in charge of the outcome. Like what happened. So you have to stick to that. You don't get to make it a happy ending if it wasn't a happy ending, right. Or you don't get to, obviously you use creative license, but I like being held to the standard of telling the truth,
Yeah, I could understand that. I can't imagine the amount of work that goes into researching for a film like this. I just can't. What is your favorite part about making the film? So you said, you have to fundraise. Like there's all the things that when you watch a film, you don't really think about how did they pay for this?
There's
There's so many, but there's a lot that goes into it. What aspect of the filmmaking is your favorite part?
Well, I did love doing the research. With my academic background, it was something I felt like I knew how to do. I mean, honestly, there are so many parts of it that I loved. I loved doing the interviews. Interviewing, our interview subjects was a very intense experience. But just incredibly rewarding, and you learn so much. The collaboration with the other professionals, with our director of photography, with the editors. I love editing because that's really how are we going to tell this story. Working with the composer was a really great experience. Getting the music right for it. So there are a lot of really cool, really fun parts of it. It is a lot of work, though. It's very intense, but it's all really interesting. The fundraising was definitely my least favorite.
It would be mine. But you got to meet John Lewis.
Yeah.
That must have been awesome.
It was. We were very, very grateful. And I have to credit Rachel Pasternak for that because she was very, very persistent with his press secretary and just kept calling and calling until he had an opening.
That must have been just an incredible experience to meet him. He's just such an interesting person and such a fine person and a thinker.
Meeting him, and I've heard other people say this, so I was like, oh, okay, I wasn't the only one who felt this way. It was like he is so humble and like regular.
Yeah.
Like he said to us, oh, I should have worn a blue shirt because somebody told me blue shirts look better on camera, At the same time, you actually feel like there's something so sacred about him. So it's really amazing because he makes you comfortable and he's so humble and down to earth. But he's also just a really pure soul.
Wow. I feel like talking to you brought me one step closer to him.
Yeah.
However that works. We do have a few questions.
Sure.
Samuel Levin asked, did Rabbi Prinz know about Khartoum before Peace Now?
How does he spell that?
Khartoum.
I don't know what that is. There was an organization that he was involved with before Peace Now, but that wasn't the name of it. I don't know if in the heat of the moment I'll be able to remember the name, but there was a peace organization started by some young men that Rabbi Prinz was sort of like an advisor to. Briefly, and they became very controversial. And they said some things that he thought were, ill-advised and foolish and not thoughtful. So he ended up sort of resigning from being their advisor. And then when Peace Now was formed, he joined Peace Now. So maybe that's what the gentleman is thinking of. I don't think it had that name though.
Okay, Mr. Levin, if you want to clarify it in the chat, I can ask. And Myrna wants to know, what do you think Rabbi Martin Luther King would say about the Black Lives Matter cause today?
What do I think Martin Luther King would think about it? I don't think I'm qualified to say that. I definitely think that both King and Rabbi Prinz would be, whether or not they agreed with every single like tactic,
Mhm.
I certainly think they would both fully support the movement and the goals of the movement, which are for the full liberation of African Americans and full equality and participation in American life.
Okay, thank you. If there are any more questions, if you put them into the chat, I can share them with Rachel. No questions.
That's because you asked such good ones.
I don't know about that, but Rachel, every time I talk to you, I'm inspired. I'm really looking forward to your next film coming out, and I hope you'll share it with us and let us present it. And as you're thinking about projects, let us know what you're working on, because your
Thank
work
you.
is the film was just exceptional, and food for thought, and I hear you, and I'm going to go walk the walk.
Well, that's the best thing you could say. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Everybody have a wonderful evening. And we're actually, we're going to start a new film tonight. They Ain't Ready for Me. And you've probably heard about it, Rachel. Tamar Manasseh is, she's a rabbinical student. She's actually going to get smicha this year. And she sits on a corner here in Chicago, 75th and Stewart. And her mission is to keep the children safe in the community. And so she will be with us on Sunday at 4:00 talking, but again, the film, there's no cost to show the film. We feel very strongly about showing these kinds of films and sharing these ideas and these topics with the community. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. And Rachel, have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
And I look forward to seeing you again sometime very soon.
Me too. And thanks everyone for coming.
Have a good night, everybody. Bye-bye.